Looks good here, flight. Good agreement.
Well, we better back off here and think about this one, Houston.
Roger.
I believe we got a hard dock, Houston.
Roger, Al. That's great. Super job, Stu.
This is really a wild place up here.
We're on the surface.
Okay, we made a good landing.
That was a beautiful one.
We landed the slope, but other than that, we're in great shape.
Yep.
Right on the landing site.
Looks like you're about on the bottom step and on the surface. Fedford, old man.
Hammer's on the surface, and it's been a long way, but we're here. Well, I'm going to try a little sand trap shot here.
That looked like a slice to me, Al.
There we go. And one more. Miles and miles and miles.
Thanks once again for joining us to Fred Haise and Gerry Griffin today. We're going to talk a little bit about them, but we're going to talk about Apollo 14. My name is Jim Kidrick, and I'm the president and CEO of the San Diego Air and Space Museum. And we're just absolutely thrilled to have these two gentlemen join us today so we can talk a little bit about something that is near and dear to us, certainly space flight, okay, but an honoring of the Apollo 14 mission. So prior to Apollo 14, January 1971, NASA and Mission Control were certainly very experienced, having already overseen 21 manned space missions, including the 6 Mercury missions from 1961 to 1963. And of course, next was Gemini, as we get closer and closer to Apollo and their 10 flights from May 65 to November 1966. And by 1971, the new Apollo program was flying men to the moon, having already set 5 manned missions to Earth's neighbor, and something that we all looked up at during our entire lives, saying, you know, it's time to go to the moon, and some might say it's time to go to Mars even after we go back to the moon. So we had Apollo 8 in December 68, Apollo 10 May of 69, Apollo 11 and the historic first moon landing, July of 69, Apollo 12 and the second moon landing in November of 69, and of course Apollo 13 in April of 1970, a flight we will reference in this program, and certainly a flight very near and dear to both of our guests today, one as a flight director and the other as one of the astronauts. So by Apollo 14, NASA was a well-oiled machine, and both of our guests today, flight director Gerry Griffin and astronaut Fred Haise, were important cogs in that machine, and remain so by ensuring that we don't forget any of that history. By the time 14 comes around, of course, Gerry had been a flight director on several Apollo flights, including Apollo 7, so important after the disastrous fire on 1 in 1968, and again on Apollos 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, and 13. So Fred and Gerry have gotten to talk to each other more times than we care to discuss here. And the team of flight directors around you on Apollo 14, we had Peter Frank, Glenn Lunny, and Milt Windler, also veteran flight directors of multiple Apollo missions. Fred, by Apollo 14, you had already flown to the moon. On Apollo 13, an experience which proved crucial to some of the problem solving on 14, and we'll talk about that today because your role was certainly more important than we originally thought it might be. You also had served on the support crew for Apollo 9, the backup crews for Apollo 8 and Apollo 11. In fact, at one point you were in line to be the lunar module pilot on on Apollo 11. You'd been in mission control during critical phases for Apollo 8 and 11. As was customary for the backup crew, you had trained to fly the missions and would be of great assistance if things went wrong, which occasionally would happen on as they do in any phase of aviation or space. So for Apollo 14, January 71, you had trained for almost every same mission on Apollo 13 and had volunteered to be a CAPCOM and to be of assistance during the Apollo 14 mission. So when you factor in hundreds of backroom technical advisors who in turn had thousands of engineers to call upon, NASA truly had an all-star team, which you two were members of, on its hands in mission control for Apollo 14. So Apollo 13's impact on a 14. This is going to kind of set the stage a little bit on some of the things that that Apollo 13 and both of you, by being involved with 13, helped you in what you were doing. There were lots of modifications to the command and service modules after 13. So we're getting to a question here, a real key question. Apollo 13, beginning with Apollo 14 and all the way to 17. They included the oxygen tanks were redesigned and a third oxygen tank was added. 5 gallons of stored water was added to the command module. An emergency battery was added to the service module. The monitoring systems on the spacecraft and at mission control were upgraded. Transferring power from the lunar module to the command module became easier. Okay, so Gerry, okay, and here we go. With all of these improvements and upgrades, did it remind you a little bit of the reset that NASA underwent after the Apollo 1 fire and prior to the Apollo 7 mission?
Well, it did have some of that. The thing that was different about it, of course, it wasn't quite as severe. And we didn't have any loss of life on 13, thank goodness. But there was and it was about half the time, by the way, to get from 13 to 14 as it was from 1 to 7 after the fire. So yeah, there was some similarity. We did all the changing in the command and service module. And we did make it better. Some people might say, when you read that list, which I'm very familiar with, that it sounded a little bit like closing the barn door after the horse was out. But we would have sure handled that next one. Had we gotten an Apollo 13 kind of a failure, we would have handled it pretty slick. And it was, it was an interesting time because one thing is we never wavered. There was never any thought of stopping, which actually the same thing happened after the fire. There was some naysayers, but by and large, the public, the Congress, the White House, all kept behind us. So by the time as you said earlier, very important point, Jim, we were pretty well oiled. In fact, we were pretty well oiled by the time we got to 13. And by the time we got to 14, we were ready. And then one final word, I think 14 started a pivot point. It didn't end it because those ended with 15, 16, and 17. But where we got more focused on exploration as opposed to the transportation system. Now, we had something yet to prove on those command and service module fixes, but they were pretty straightforward and there was nothing that was dynamically different. It just gave us more capability. And so about 13, 14, 15 is in that time frame. Just like a test airplane, when Boeing builds a new commercial airplane, they test it a lot before they start flying passengers and getting revenue. In a sense, that's kind of the way the early Apollo flights were. We wanted to make sure we could get to the moon and back and do it without, killing somebody in the process. And but by 14, I felt like, and I thought we were ready for 13. We really were getting into the exploration mode. Sure, we were trying to be safe and get out there and do it right, but we really started to focus on the science. And I don't know if Fred felt that change or not, but I sure did, that we were getting a lot better at trying to figure out why we were going to the moon and what we were going to do when we got there than we were early on.
That's great. Fred, same question, because, you think of the Fire in 1, Wally taking the crew up in 7 and bam, 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 and you on 13. What were you feeling, in this 13 to 14 and all the modifications as it might relate to what happened to 1 to 7?
Well, as Gerry said, that the things they did, the added oxygen tank, and actually the battery, emergency battery, I think was a lunar module decent battery,
yep.
Came out of the accident investigation on 13. And frankly, if NASA, if it was a military vehicle, they would have followed mil specs, and those commodities like oxygen, the hydrogen, the critical commodities would have not been all clustered together. The military aircraft, you want things on geographically separated. So any aircraft doesn't take out everything. And of course, NASA didn't worry about that. And that's what actually caused the problem to get more serious than it might have been had we followed mil specs in the design. But at any rate, a couple of other things they added that we had to wrestle with was storing the urine for a day and a half. We had to do some workarounds for that. So I think they added a vessel on board 14 that possibly you could do that. Another commodity we did not have was blank paper. We had no blank paper. So when we had to write down the very long, lengthy, for instance, power up procedure for the mothership, the capsule, we had to I didn't, but Jack Swigert copied it, and he had to tear off backs and fronts of checklist books, which were blank, obviously, and he could number the pages, and that's how the procedure was copied down. So, a few incidental things like that that had not been thought of that we dealt with were added to just in case things went really bad again on 14. I felt the fixes themselves were pretty straightforward to address. The problems we had, should it happen again, they would have been in better shape to obviously stay powered up and get home okay. So I think that the manifestation of the problem we had was covered for 14, and felt confident in that respect. The vehicles would do the job.
Of all the improvements, what did you think was the most significant improvement?
Well, obviously the cryogenics to have it separated so you could preserve your fuel cells. The capsule and the service module, their main electric power was fuel cells, which depended on oxygen and hydrogen. And the only battery power was 3 small 44 amp hour entry batteries, which you had to obviously protect and preserve for entry time. So that was probably the major fix that made it comfortable in a sense of you could still keep the command module powered up and have everything operating normal to come back home.
Right. Gerry, what do you think the most significant one was?
Well, I think Fred hit it. The cryo, it was interesting how they did that third tank when they added it. They followed more like the mil spec that Fred was mentioning. They put it on the other side of the service module in a bay opposite 180 degrees around. And the one thing they did, I thought that was pretty good, or very good, is that if you did lose those 2 tanks over on the other side and fuel cells, you could isolate that tank so that it was not connected to those 2. You wouldn't lose it. You could shut it off from all of that, and you could feed that O2 right to the command module. So it was not only more quantity, it was a little better arrangement on how, if you got into that kind of problem again, you could keep going. The battery they put in was, as Fred mentioned, was that one of those descent batteries out of the lunar module, and they 415 amp hour battery. It was a big horse. And so I think the fixes that when it all came up, between the cryo and the power, you pretty well got it there. And I was on the 13 guys that went out to Downey that helped fix it after 13. And it was a good improvement. We really felt good about it.
So you're pretty much saying nobody's out there with a jump start for the car, when you're way out there. Okay, so the commander of 14, Alan Shepard, kind of the granddaddy, okay, of the group by this time. One of the original Mercury 7 and the first American in space. Aboard Freedom 7. His crewmates, Stuart Roosa, lunar module pilot Edgar Mitchell, making their first space flights. Roosa and Mitchell had joined NASA, in 1966 as part of the 5th group of astronauts. Fred, you spent a lot of time training with these guys. What were they like?
Well, I actually knew Ed quite a bit more because Ed and I spent almost a year and a half before we got our first crew assignments in testing of the lunar module. So I spent almost, lots and lots of hours with Ed through that process. Ed was obviously, because of that, as I was, very knowledgeable about the lunar module. We both had spent so much time. We had tested not just the LEM, we were primarily working on was LEM 3, which was going to be the first one to go to orbit. For a while, we were working LEM 2, which was meant to be the first to go to orbit. But all the wiring changes after the fire to whole schedule, they just pushed it aside and jumped to LEM 3 to stay on schedule. But we also tested LEM 4, 5, and 6 because they were in the assembly line. So we tested all the LEMs up through Apollo 10's LEM, I guess. So Apollo 11's, right? No, let's see, yeah, Apollo 10's. So anyway, we were very versatile in that. Ed was a very highly educated. He was a PhD, so he was a very savvy, more so maybe in that sense of things, and had been very involved in science in a way that most of us, I guess, at the time had not been. Stu was, in fact, both of them I knew from Edwards days through the Aerospace Test Pilot School, Chuck Yeager ran. And Stu was also out of that area and was, I'll call Stu was a pilot's pilot type guy. I had more time with Stu actually because on Apollo 16, when 18 and 19 got canceled, I inherited Stu and Ed to finish up the training assignment as the backup crew on 16. So I was with him every day. Stu was the kind of guy would be getting ready to do TEI, which is trans-earth injection. It's kind of supposedly a very critical time. We're in the simulator with mission control. And Stu would start doing this drumming sound like Hollywood, for a very tremendous event coming up. So he was a fun guy to be around. Al, for the most part, was a business-like. He didn't say a lot, and if you're on the wrong side, you didn't want to hear him say a lot. And but he was, I would say, particularly considering the time he had been since he had been in a training cycle. But for age and when you jumped in it, because it's tough. It's a lot of hours, a lot of days a week, up to as you're getting closer to launch, 7 days a week even. He stood in there and did the job to get really ready. And incidentally, the landing he made was the closest to the spot the computer would have landed of all the missions. Now, wow. I can't say that was not just from piloting. Other missions had to move because of obstacles, where they might have landed, equally as close. But he has had that distinction. So he did a real good job through the landing and where he placed it down.
Well, if I were him, I just would have said it was because of me.
Right. Oh yeah. Right. You're right.
So
he probably thought it.
that's right. Okay, so Gerry, okay, you worked with these guys. Give us your viewpoint of them also.
Well, very similar to Fred. We saw quite a lot of these people because they passed through as CAPCOMS. Now, Al did not, but because he was a boss by then, he was kind of at the top of the food chain in the astronaut office. And he and Deke were kind of Slayton were kind of the senior people that, but they were all in the control center a lot. And Stu and Ed were both CAPCOMs, got to know them very well. I can imagine, I didn't know that, but I can imagine Stu having the drum roll before TEI. He was always, I got tickled just looking at him because he had that impish grin that was just, I don't know, he was like a magnet to humor. And Ed was more serious, more studious kind of guy, but very, very calm. And the thing I remember about Ed is a gentleman, a real gentleman, very, very nice. Al, with us, we had worked with him before he got finally at age 47, by the way, when he took off on Apollo 14. So we've been around Al quite a bit. He was always, as Fred said, he was businesslike, but he was friendly. I think he liked the flight control people, especially because he knew they were kind of watching out after the backs of his astronauts, and he was always, when we had a problem or something, he was right there and would nod his head whether he agreed with what we were going to try or not. But he was a pro. When I think of him, I think as a professional test pilot. Very much kind of no nonsense. He had a impish grin too, that you, like Fred said, you didn't want to see the opposite of that, but the grin was kind of nice, and that kind of curling smile like most test pilots have, fighter pilots have. Very nice guy.
Well, you talked a little bit about getting onto the science of the missions. And Fredo made a comment, he's got the PhD, he's got Edgar there, a little more sciencey than the others. How about that?
Well, I think when we say science, in terms of the mission, the job was to be a good field geologist. To obviously, I was planning ahead based on the photography that was available, to kind of pick the traverse or the path you would follow, to pick the various units, rock units, and sampling accordingly to psych out the site. Of course, in 13 and 14, it was a pretty simple traverse. It was to explore Cone Crater. It was a feature in a little small hillock mountain range south of the Imbrium Basin. And it was thought that was formed by the big meteorite that hit and formed that big dark area, the Imbrium Basin, which I think some people think is the left eye of the face of the moon. And that splash material had poured out of there, formed those hills to the south. So by virtue of sampling in that area, and particularly Cone Crater, and to depth, you would get a picture of what came out of there at some depth on the surface. And the way a meteorite, when it hits, it has an upturn of debris. So if you're going, like in this case, they were going up slope, up the hill toward Cone Crater, the samples they were getting first would be from the deepest part. And really the rocks at the surface would be right at the lip of the crater. So it's kind of a backwards way of sampling, but it would give you the whole, if you sample correctly up the slope, would give you all the way to the depth of that crater. Now, actually, to give credit to Jack Schmidt, I would say the start of the lunar geology training that grew was on our mission on 13. We had time because the missions had stretched out after 11 on July 12, didn't fly till November, and we had all the way to April. Jim Lovell wasn't intrigued with that. He was kind of like, still, we just need to be sure we can get there and back in one piece. And Jack arranged a meeting with a professor he had at Caltech named Lee Silver at a restaurant in Cocoa Beach. And Lee, he was a very gregarious fellow, easy to like, and talked Jim into saying, Jim, just give me one field trip with you and see what you think, and we can do more than if you agree. So that's what kicked it off, and we did considerably more than previous missions had done, almost up to within a month or a little over of our launch, doing field trips on 13. But Jack Schmidt was the guy who thought that we should do, we who were assigned the missions should do more field geology work to become better observers and be more appreciative of the sampling we did in the protocol, and sampling to have good samples for people to analyze that we brought back.
Well, I think you're right. Everybody really gives Jack a lot of credit, for the rock collection protocols. Now, I have to share this because it's still one of the funniest things I've ever heard, and it was from Charlie Duke, okay? Because as you're discussing here, there was a great deal of time and energy and education and, what we're looking for. And Charlie one time said to me, he said to the group, he says, I just picked up one of every color. And that would be the classic Air Force pilot, right? Isn't that what an Air Force pilot? Anyway. And the Navy guy wouldn't say that, but I still think that's just, it kind of just makes sure that you cover it all. And because that protocol, as you describe here, was very, very important. Gerry, when they're out there looking for rocks, okay, and, they've got to be chatting with you guys about what they're seeing.
Yeah, and I didn't know that story that Fred just told about meeting in Cocoa Beach with Lee Silver. And because we took it to another level on 15, I was lead flight director, and Dave Scott, who was commander, said, hey, Gerry, you ought to come out on a field trip with us and kind of watch how we do this, because I think it would help, the guys in the control center figure out what you can and can't do, and kind of, just get into the science mode. Well, I went out there. I went to New Mexico to a site that looked very much like Hadley Rill on 15, and Lee Silver was there. And I struck up a friendship with him that lasted, still there, I guess. He's still alive. He was amazing. I can see why he was a renowned professor at Caltech, but he had this easygoing movie voice, and he was really good at it. But he taught me in 2 field trips a lot about geology and what to look for. Well, I went back and told Kranz about it and told other people. We ended up sending all kinds of leadership clear up to the headquarters level. Rocco Petrone went out. And I think it opened a lot of eyes. And now that's when the pivot towards science really came true. We were all much more focused on the science. And it did help us as we went through a mission. We had a back room that was full of science people. And they would ask for modifications to the plan, or they would ask us to ask the crew a question about something they had commented on. But by and large, the astronauts, in fact, Lee Silver told me that if he had had most of the astronauts that he trained in the field, if he had them for about a semester at Caltech, they could have probably qualified for a degree, either a master's or a PhD, because they were that good. They got into it and really studied the situation. And it is fascinating. I remember he taught me about slumps and tilts and all that. And I can't go into the hillsides anymore without looking for them. He got me started down kind of a path of interest in geology. And but I think the crews got very good at it. They were, particularly by the time we got to 17 and 16, 17, they'd been at it a long time and had done a lot of field training. And the control center guys, we ended up sending all the flight directors out on a field trip. And so all of us that handled EVAs after that looked at it differently.
Yeah, between my rookie early, not even a year, but that 9 months probably, I did 10 geology field trips, but also we only did one on 11. We made one trip is all we did on 11. Went out just east of El Paso. But then counting 13 training and 16, all total, I did over 30 geology field trips through the training for those missions plus my rookie year. So
well, I'm envious of both of you because you wouldn't know this, but I'm planning a ghost town, old mining towns and all that stuff trip for a bunch of people sometime in May. You are both invited because if we can find gold, I'll or silver or whatever, I want you to know you're both in. So
Okay.
consider it an invite.
I want Fred on my side.
Okay.
Okay.
I don't want much of a cut, maybe, 60, 70%. Anyway, but I really am planning a trip. We'll start out with Bodie, California. We'll go anyway, all sorts of places. From my old days up in Fallon, because Fallon is like you're talking about, certainly. Fallon, Nevada. Okay, so launch day comes along. Okay, we got a 40-minute weather delay on the day of the flight. Other flights in the Mercury and Gemini program had been delayed, but this was the first launch delay of Apollo. Okay, and I know I've chatted a little bit with both of you on this. We'll start out with Fred. After everything that went wrong on 13, was this weather delay kind of an ominous sign when you're looking at from your angle?
No, I did not. That didn't strike me that way. We were just faced with Florida, and
Yeah.
Florida has a tendency to sometimes have those days, thunderstorms, as we saw in 12, which was pretty bad with a lightning strike. And no, it didn't seem ominous. Certainly not from the standpoint of the mission eventually going and being successful.
Good. Gerry, you're an on-time kind of guy. Okay. You're looking at mission control. You're looking at all this stuff and clicking it off and the countdown's going on. What'd you think?
Well, I was the flight director for the launch of Apollo 12. If I learned anything, I learned that you don't want to launch if the weather's not right. So no, it was not in fact, I had been amazed that we had stayed on all those missions had been launched right on time and that we hadn't had a delay before 14. 14, we only delayed 40 minutes and then we went. And so it wasn't much of an impact. It was a nice launch that worked just fine.
Well, that's great. So pretty much the mood and mission control, and it was, pretty, hey, we're doing our job. Okay, yeah. So what if Apollo 14 had missed the 4-hour launch window on January 31st?
Gone the next day or 2 days later. It depends on how far you were into fueling, as I recall. Fred, I think I'm right. If you got to a certain point, you had to offload a lot of fuel.
Yeah, we changed the plan. I think with 13 to launch not necessarily on the optimum day and time, but and have to go on a non-free return path that bought us extra days. Obviously, it had been extremely traumatic had it been a much longer delay because the tanks had been filled, like the RCS tanks, and on the command module, service module, and command module. And there was, unlike shuttle, the command and service module, they were not built with what you call easy ability to drain the fluids. And they could not have afforded to sit in there for a month.
Right.
Without worrying about damaging seals. So they would have had to haul the whole stack back to the VAB and demate everything. And I'm not sure, they might have had to cut the lines to get the stuff out of there. And
as I recall, Fred, and I may be wrong here, but it seems like we finally got to a point, we had about 3 days where we could slip a day and go the next day and then the next day. And then we would start running out of and that's where that non-optimum trajectory came in so that we could have some more flexibility. But we would have probably just gone the next day in this case.
No,
Okay.
I'm just saying if somehow we got delayed beyond those 3 days.
Yeah.
It would have been a big deal to have to haul it back to the VAB and kind of go through the destacking and all that again.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're launched. We're heading towards the moon. Okay, we know our destination. We ran into a little situation with the docking of the command service module and the lunar module. In the official report, and I'm going to quote here, it was called failure to achieve docking probe engagement. And in fact, it took 6 attempts to successfully achieve capture latch engagement, I'm reading quotes here, between the CSM and the LM, the lunar module. If docking had not been completed successfully, would they have had to abort? Gerry, why don't we start with you?
Well, I guess you could have decided to go on to the moon and fly a command service module mission only, kind of a repeat that we would have had to build in real time, but you could have gone on to the moon and just not taken the LEM with you. That would have been a very bad situation, particularly falling right on the heels of Apollo 13, to have a failure or another one where you couldn't land. But I think we would have probably figured out something to not just abort and come home immediately, and maybe get something meaningful out of the flight. It's also it was an issue that I know all of us were really concerned that we weren't going to get it. And for the audience, maybe it's important to understand that the lunar module was carried behind the command and service module on the Saturn V in that stack. And once we did translunar injection and started for the moon, then the command and service module separated, turned around, docked with the lunar module, and extracted it from that third stage of the Saturn V. So that's what we're talking about. It was that docking where we were trying to just hook the LEM to the front of the command and service module so we could extract it from the booster and go on to the moon. So if we hadn't done that, we never would have gotten the LEM out. And what happened is the probe has some capture latches. It's a probe and drogue system, and it has some capture latches that are kind of spring-loaded and stick in a hole, and then you can't pull it back out. That's a soft dock, but at least you're connected. Then you pull the big clamps in and clamp it up tight, make the pressure seal, so forth. Fred can go into that in great detail because he knew a lot about it. But we had to do that, and on the 6th try, we actually never did get the capture latches to engage. What we had him do is he went in right up against it and then started a low thrust to thrust the vehicle into it. Then he fired the big latches, essentially, and fired the latches that really clamped the whole thing down, and it worked. When the probe, they actually brought back to Earth because you had to clear that out to get through the tunnel anyway. So figured out a way to get it home, and they couldn't find anything wrong with it. And the mission report said it was probably one of two things. It either wasn't cocked properly, but that later they kind of said, no, that's probably not it. Those latches had to be cocked, I guess. in a certain kind of way. They said it was probably contamination, that when Stu pushed and fired, that it knocked it loose or it came out or something, but they never found anything. So it was kind of a spooky failure, but the probe and drogue worked just fine after that. We had to use it again at the moon twice, and it worked just fine.
No, the only thing I'd add to that, that's pretty good, explains it. It was a great piloting job by Stu to nestle it in there as he did and do the thrusting to initially get the latches set. I think he was a little upset about it because there was happy to have it done, but there was a contest going on between the command module pilots of who would use the least amount of fuel to affect that docking and capture. And of course, Stu used a lot more fuel than he normally would have. So he wasn't very high in the running for minimum fuel use for a command module pilot.
Well, it sounds like on the carrier, in-flight refueling at night, and of course you needed to get fuel. That's why you needed to get that probe in there and connect up. So, well, and we all know how tough some of those things are, and I'll tell you, they really are. The at the moon, okay, 14 gets to the moon. Some minor little glitches. They end up with a lunar landing abort switch anomaly. In fact, it had to be reset 5 times, including 2 times after reading up on some new procedures from Mission Control. Fredo, from your standpoint, ever any thought they might not be able to land on the moon?
Yeah, certainly if they could not get around that switch, sending that discrete called abort to the computer, they could not go into P63, which was the landing top of the point where you went in the landing program, or it would immediately gone into an abort program. So they had to somehow get that switch out of the picture. And as you said, they reset it by Ed tapping on it. I think he tapped on it, and that made him think maybe there's a solder ball or something inside that switch, and that was making contact. And by tapping it, he freed it, but then it would drift and get back and make the contact again. So what they did was, with Draper Labs figuring it out, Don Iles, I think was the fellow's name, they invented a patch, if you will, which include manually keystroking into the disky, which was the keyboard, to in essence make the computer not look at the switch. I guess a simple way of putting it. So by Ed carefully keystroking in, and as I'm sure normally, as we always did with something that delicate, before you did any proceeds on any of those things, that both crewmen checked the data and made sure it was right, and to get it in, and of course that was successful, and they were able to bypass that switch and go directly into P63, and then affect the landing. Of course, the thing they had to worry about then, of course, is at any time downstream, they no longer could use that switch to do an abort. Obviously, it has a second switch called abort stage, but the abort button would no longer be operative. So they'd have to do a manual abort if they needed to do it on the way down.
Got it. It sounds like the old, procedure when something's not working, on-off switch to off, on-off switch back to on. And, I always try that first. So Gerry, down at Mission Control, this is all going on. What are you guys doing?
Well, again, here I drew the short straw. I was the flight director on that landing. And I really thought that, good gosh, if we don't get this one done, now we're not going to be able to land. We'd already gotten past the docking thing. Pete Frank handled that one. And, but it was a serious problem. I thought it was interesting when Fred described it. Now, you're an airplane driver, so you've probably been asked, or you've done the same thing. The gauge didn't look right, so you tapped it. Very scientific troubleshooting. Just tap on it. And sure enough, it went out when they did. And then it came back on. They tried it again and got it off. And so I think when the Don Iles that Fred mentioned as a young engineer at Draper Labs, MIT, and they had built the computer and had written the software. So he was the guy, a young fella, that came up with this fix of these bunch of numbers that you could stroke into the keyboard, and it would make the computer ignore that switch. And so it was a good fix. And when I think about it now, of course, today we would have probably had 3 different ways to make sure that doesn't happen. But that was pretty grassroots stuff. Solder ball and a switch, and and that kind of thing. And they went back, I think, after that and looked at some other switches and other lunar modules that were on the ground, and found that the quality wasn't as good as it should have been. So they fixed it up. But yeah, that was a close one, and that could have kept us from landing.
Yeah, you over there with the soldering iron.
Yeah.
we need to ramp it up just a bit. Okay, so eventually Apollo 14's lunar module successfully lands on the moon on February 5th. The landing site, the Fra Mauro Highlands, was the original site for Apollo 13. Fred, tell us about that site.
Well, as I earlier mentioned, it was a hilly area. It was the first landing proposed out of the Mars, which is relatively smooth, but we saw both on 11 and 12. This snow place that's actually really smooth on the moon, because there's rocks of various sizes from smaller craters all over the place, where Neil had to readjust where he landed. And to a little degree, I think Pete, not as much, on Pete Conrad on 12. But it was still a hilly area, and that was the first time we were going to go into that. And we knew there'd be quite a bit of debris. In spite of knowing the debris, we did not have aerial from the orbiter photographs of a resolution to really know. I forget what size rock you could see down to, but there were rocks much bigger than what you knew they were going to be there. And of course, we were worried about that because we were going to land at the foot of this crater that had been hit by a meteorite. So we knew a lot of stuff was going to be thrown out of it. So it was a little bit uncertainty in that sense of also with that landing site. But it was meant to land near the base where it had leveled out a little bit from that crater, and to really then follow through with the primary EVA on the second one to explore the front flank, go right up that hill to the crater, which turned out to be a little tougher job than also anybody figured it might be.
No, I'm totally sure of that. Okay, so everybody's down in Mission Control talking about the geological significance of this particular point, like Fred is describing. So what's going on in Mission Control during this time, and talk down there trying to maybe get someone to, the astronauts to focus on a particular area?
Well, I think Mission Control, of course, is involved in 2 things. One is we were watching out for the status of the backpacks that the guys were wearing out on. And that was our primary responsibility when you think about it. Inside the mission control room itself was the systems, and we were still looking after the lunar module too, although nobody was in it, but we were monitoring its systems to the best that we could. So we were making a number of calls every once in a while about their backpack to do something maybe, and we had a little signal with them that was called the PLIS, PLSS, Portable Life Support System. And sometimes the docs would say, hey, their heart rates are getting up to about 150, 160. And we'd say, hey, how about a PLIS check? And that meant to slow down, but it had a purpose. They would read out their reading of O2 and water and that kind of thing and it was kind of a code to slow down. I think when they were going up Cone Crater at that steepest part, and it got really steep. I think Al was up in the 160 range heartbeats per minute. Ed was 150, something like that. They were huffing and puffing. That was hard work. And the surgeons never were, I don't think they were frightened or anything like that, but I know I kept an eye on it just to kind of see how they were doing. And, they would stop and their heart rates would immediately slow down. It was just hard. It was like working out in a gym, I guess. And the other thing, but then, as I mentioned earlier, we did have a science back room. And if I'm not mistaken, I think by this time, I think Lovell was actually in charge of that room. And he had guys like Lee Silver and Gordy Swan from the USGS and Bill Muhlberger from the University of Texas, all these famous geologists in that room. And Jim was the one that kind of collected their thoughts and translated it into something he could talk to the CAPCOM about or talk to the flight director about and see if he could get them to do something maybe a little off their flight plan. But as I said earlier, by and large, these guys knew what they were doing. They knew where they were going. They knew what they were looking for. And they had the little MET, the modular equipment transporter called the rickshaw. That Fred could probably give you a lot about how it was in training. And they put samples on that thing. They had tools. They ended up, I think, kind of at the end of that steepest part of Cone Crater, they were actually carrying it. They picked it up and just brought it along with them, trying to struggle up that hill.
Yeah, it turned out to be not the help they thought, because again, the terrain wasn't smooth, rocks all over the place. So that again, it would tend to turn over, hitting on one side on a rock, and so they were fighting it part of the time going up that slope, which added to the workload.
Yeah.
Instead of a help, it only for short times did it appear to be a help. It was mainly a hindrance to have that rickshaw to tug along.
Fred, the one thing I always thought was kind of cool about it, though, is we could see the tracks, and we knew they knew how to get back to the lunar module because it was real clear where those tracks ran.
Yeah.
So if they had to get back in a hurry, they wouldn't have to figure out which way to go.
Yeah, they did not. They got just about. I don't know. Somebody figured out how far they were from the lip. I actually was concerned a little bit. They don't get too close to that lip because we carried a lanyard, each of us. So if one of the astronauts, partner fell into a smaller crater, we could toss this lanyard down that he could hook up to his suit and we could help tug him out. Cone Crater was a lot deeper than that. So if somebody went in that crater, they're going to be there a while. So it didn't bother me they didn't get right to the edge because we didn't know, how sturdy that would be. And Ed, I know, got frustrated because he knew they were close. And he called me a bad name. He called me a fink.
A fink. I remember that.
Had to push him, with Mr. Crow wanting to push him to get started back to the limb because of the consumables and the backpack.
Yeah.
So anyway, they were a little frustrated. Ed particularly was frustrated. He didn't get to the rim. I assume just to have at least a look down into the crater. But
I just saw a piece somewhere in something that the best estimate is they got within somewhere between 50 to 75 feet of the lip. So they were close. Yeah. And they said the sampling was probably as good there as it was at the lip. So in spite of what Ed thought.
Well, okay. So first of all, I'm going to take Lee Silver on this mining ghost town tour.
Yeah,
for sure. He's on my list now. And now that I'm going to ask a question of the Fink, which I didn't know that you had a nickname, Fredo, because, and this is a little more of what you're discussing, during Al and, Ed's 2 EVAs lasted 9 hours and 20 plus minutes. They collected 94 pounds of moon rocks, including Big Bertha, the third largest moon rock ever retrieved. Fred, a little more about that, because this whole topic of picking up these moon rocks, like you said, they were working pretty hard. And what were you talking about that wasn't the rickshaw wasn't quite working as they expected?
Well, it was supposed to be something you just hold and tug behind you, which Gerry said carried equipment of various sorts. You could put your samples you collected in a center section to stow, and when you don't have, and it's a two-wheel vehicle, so you're holding onto a handle. So when you're hitting all these rocks scattered all over the place, it would tend to tip over. I don't know, maybe it did tip over or dump some stuff out at times. It'd slow them up, but it was just added workload. As far as the rock sampled, I think I earlier said that the intent was to sample that area because it was thought to be the fallout from the Imbrium Basin, the big, very large, dark area to the north of that region. And this was supposed to be splash material that had come out of that large crater when a very big meteorite had hit eons ago. It turned out some of the rocks were breccia rocks. Breccias are rocks that have been broken apart, and then through the heat of the event, in that case, the meteorite impact eons, billions of years ago, had and melted, had reformed together, and they found those sorts of rocks, which led them to believe, convinced that it came out of the Imbrium Basin. The age dating that was done on these rocks, they collected, I don't know if all of them were, but at least there was at least one sample they age dated. It was the oldest rock ever collected on any of the missions. So it's older than any other sample, and it may have been more than one, that were collected on all the landing missions in Apollo.
Wow.
So I'd say at least it was convincing to some degree that the rocks they were getting had come, and that whole hillock area had been formed from the debris coming out of the Imbrium Basin.
Well, it had to be very exciting. And so Gerry, in Mission Control, when they run across this one that they now call Big Bertha, was there any, they find something this large, do they, and you're listening to the conversation, do they, oh my God, look at this one, that kind of thing?
Well, we didn't have the coverage of TV that you would have liked to have had when they were going up Cone Crater, for instance. We couldn't see them because they were too far from the lunar module. Later, when we had the rover on the later missions, we had a television camera so we could see them. So we just had to listen to what they were saying, and it not having the visual didn't make it real dynamic to hear, but I always thought when they got excited about picking up something, my first thought was pick that sucker up and get it back, and it turned out to be a great find, Big Bertha, and the every mission had one of those. I can remember 15 was, Fred helped me, was it a plagioclase that is another kind of,
Yep.
And that was that real white rock that Scott picked up, I think, or maybe it was Jim Irwin, and everybody was yahoo. Yeah, no, the science guys were all happy. Those of us in the control center didn't know the geology quite as well as those guys in the back room did. So right. we couldn't get quite as excited over a plagioclase versus a breccia, and but they all sounded neat, and at least we knew where they came from. That's what what I could feel.
I think Big Bertha was just probably they figured it was the largest rock that they rationally could take back. I'm sure there were a lot of rocks like all these sites had rocks much bigger than that. In fact, later you'll see in later missions they're standing up to rocks that are bigger than the people standing by the rock.
Oh yeah.
So I think Big Bertha was just one that had good crystalline look to it, and that was probably about as big a size as they figured they could fit and bring home. And so that's why it was picked up and called Big Bertha. But I'm sure there were many other big berthers that were bigger available around that area.
Oh, yeah.
Well, I'm sure Callaway Golf would say they have the real Big Bertha. So
Yeah, there you go.
tune in next week for the second half of our interview with astronaut Fred Haise and flight director Gerry Griffin. Thanks for joining us.